Here we are, another idyllic scene. A little bit different to what we see happening in Australia today. I was very interested in seeing what would happen to the ex-CEO of the Essendon Football Club. Now, we saw a pylon, what's described as a pylon in that situation. And the pylon wasn't about his financial mismanagement of the National Australia Bank, where he's admonished by the Royal Commissioner for many indiscretions, which created a lot of significant issues for many people, leading to bankruptcy, loss of their financial resources, their security. But it was all about his religious beliefs, the fact that he was the head of a church which was anti-abortion and which wasn't happy with gays. It's interesting, because obviously 50 years ago it would have been the other way around. And the dilemma is, you cannot really legislate your way out of discrimination. We have many examples of discrimination. Obviously the Essendon Football Club, which is a privately owned corporation which is owned by its members, has the ability to set the criteria about the type of people they would like to work for them. And we see that with church-based organisations around the country, where they have specific criteria for employing people. Now, I could bore you with stories about the times I've been discriminated against because of my political position, where jobs have disappeared, been restructured, where I've been forced to move to another state, and the list goes on and on. The fact is, discrimination in a society based on private investment for private profit is part and parcel of everyday existence. And to think we can legislate our way out of discrimination is ridiculous. Because one week, as we are currently seeing in the United States of America, abortion is legal, and the next week, it's illegal. We see countries around the world where to be gay is a criminal offence. And in some countries in the Middle East, where to be gay can lead to your execution. So allowing the state to determine what is discriminatory behaviour or not does not actually solve the issue. Because one day you could have legislation which says that gay behaviour is legal, next day it's illegal. It all depends on the will of the Parliament, or the will of the institutions which run that particular state apparatus. Now, I've recently seen in Cuba a referendum passed by the Cuban people, which incorporated many rights within their constitutional framework against the wishes of their government. And we are currently seeing a debate regarding a referendum next year, at the latter half of next year, to give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders a constitutional voice to Parliament. And that's the key. That is the key. If you want to deal with discrimination, whether it's based on age, culture, language, sexual orientation, gender, race, nationality, stature, and the list goes on and on. those protections need to be incorporated in the constitutional framework of the country, not in the constitutional framework of a state like Victoria, where the constitution can be changed by a majority in both houses of parliament, but a constitutional framework where the people as a whole make that decision. It was interesting that when we had the decision which went to the people regarding gay marriage, it was a plebiscite. It was not a referendum. And there is a huge difference between a plebiscite and a referendum. If a referendum passes in 4 states and is passed by the majority of electors, it is then incorporated in the constitutional framework of this country. That means that no government at a future date can remove that right without going back to the people in a referendum. And that's why the Liberal National Party held a plebiscite, not a referendum, because they didn't want to have marriage equality incorporated in the Australian Constitution. And it's the same with the legislative frameworks we see currently, which were a highlight of these days, when people are refused employment because of opinions they hold. Now, this is nothing new. Anybody who's a militant trade unionist knows that every private corporation, every state apparatus is a blacklist. And you can apply for as many jobs as you like within that particular field of human endeavour, and you will find you will never obtain that job. It's the same with disability. If you've got certain viewpoints, you'll find you get jobs. If you've got other viewpoints, you don't get jobs. It's the same as age. It's all very well to have an application form which doesn't discriminate, but the issue is that ultimately you're employed by somebody, whether it's at a state level or a private level, unless you are self-employed. And many people turn to self-employment because it gives them that freedom to escape those discriminatory practices. And the problem with legislation which is not based, has constitutional protections, is that it can be changed, as we saw with the US Supreme Court, where legislation, where Roe versus Wade was changed by the Supreme Court 50 years later because it was not in their constitutional framework. It's the same here. The dilemma with the prohibitive legislation we are seeing passed around the country is that it creates an underclass. It creates a new discriminatory landscape. So people who have unpopular religious beliefs, and that's the key, unpopular religious beliefs today, find themselves discriminated against. While in the past, those who had unpopular beliefs were discriminated against. And we constantly see discrimination not based on the ability of somebody to do the work, but discrimination based on their political opinions, discrimination based on their age, their race, their culture. And the fact is, it is a cultural issue. Ultimately, it is a cultural issue. And to a significant degree, discrimination is part and parcel of everyday life. Now, you may be able to legislate against the more extreme examples, but when it comes to popular acceptance of those particular pieces of legislation and the ability for that legislation not to be rescinded by a future parliament, what that needs to happen is that those laws or those ideas need to be incorporated in a constitutional framework. Now, Australians for a very long time have not understood the limitations of this country's constitutional framework. The Australian Constitution was designed after a series of meetings in the various states, the colonial states. And these discussions started in the late 1880s with conventions in the 1890s. And a specific decision was made to leave out any human rights in the Australian Constitution apart from the right to freedom of religion and the right to compensation if your land is forcefully acquired by the state. The American Constitution was looked at but discarded because what they wanted was a constitutional framework which regulated the relationship between the states, which at that stage were independent colonial entities, and an emerging central government, which was the federal government. And referendums needed to be held in each state before federation was possible in 1901. And interestingly, the people of New South Wales rejected federation during the first referendum that was held because they didn't want to support what they described as the pauper states, the other states of the federation, especially the smaller states like South Australia, Tasmania, Queensland and West Australia at that particular period. And it was only after a second referendum that the people of New South Wales agreed to federate. So in 1901, when federation occurred, it's no accident that the first Act of Parliament which went through the Australian Parliament, which was only opposed by one member of Parliament, was the White Australia policy. Because if there had been constitutional protections within, so the constitutional arrangements govern the way we live is exceptionally important, especially if there are no human rights protections in the constitutional framework. That's why over the last 40 years, during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation era, we have seen the wholesale sell-off of assets which were owned by the government of the day, whether it was energy, telecommunication, ports, airports, health funds, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Because all these entities, including the Crown land, are not owned by the people because they're not protected in the Australian Constitution. So we see the wholesale sale of financial institutions like the Commonwealth Bank, which was initially built up with taxpayers' money, which was making a profit for the Australian people on an ideological whim. And this can occur because these assets and properties were the property of the government of the day, which theoretically represents the Australian people. When in reality, it's the constitutional framework which protects the Australian people. And as far as representative democratic constitutions are concerned, the Australian Constitution has fewer protections than English common law protections in Great Britain, and they don't even have a written constitution. So when it comes to discrimination, if we want effective mechanisms to deal with discrimination, what we need is a debate in society regarding the need to have a referendum, not a plebiscite, but a referendum which guarantees people rights, which guarantees people's rights irrespective of their age, their sexual orientation, their gender, their culture, the language they speak, their religious beliefs. Because although you have a right to choose your religious belief, you don't have a right constitutionally that those religious beliefs are protected and that you are protected. Not just talking about religious beliefs, but also atheism. So think about it. Next time we see some state government pass another law to ensure, theoretically, non-discriminatory practices in society, unless there's one, a cultural shift, which is required by governments at all levels, local, state and federal, promoting those cultural shifts, not because of a legislative process, but because that cultural shift will create a better, more harmonious, more egalitarian society, and also a shift to see rights for each and everybody incorporated in the constitutional framework, which we don't have today. So although these may seem theoretical, the reality is today you may have legislation which protects marriage equality, and you may have legislation against racial discrimination, and you may have legislation against ageism, and the list goes on and on. The fact is, this legislation cannot address those underlying issues unless we are willing to debate those issues and see every institutional framework debate those issues and every private and corporate sector debate those issues. Not because there's some type of legislation and some theoretical penalty, but because those rights are incorporated in the constitutional framework which determines the type of society we have. In 1999, I stood during that particular plebiscite regarding the monarchy, on a new constitution for a new millennium ticket, which had minuscule support. And unless we have a new constitutional framework, nothing will ever change in this society. We may be able to whitewash the worst excesses of those discriminatory policies which exist culturally and legally in this country, but we will never be able to address that issue. So think about it. To me, the CEO, or the proposed CEO of the Essendon Football Club, which is a private matter for them, was not suitable because of his financial dealings, not because of his religious beliefs. And these are religious beliefs which are held by a significant segment of the Australian population. So ultimately, if we want to end discrimination, we need a Bill of Rights incorporated in the Australian Constitution which ensures that not only is discrimination illegal, but ensures that no state government can pass discriminatory legislation without a referendum.